Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Invest Africa. I'm Nozipho Mbanjwa. Now, information communication technologies are playing a significant role in transforming African economies. ICTs have contributed on Africa's GDP, increasing on average at 5% a year over the past decade. And joining me in studio now to discuss innovation in ICT in Africa is Yaron Asabi. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Digital Solutions Group. Frank Rizzo, Partner for Information Technology Advisory, this at KPMG, and in our Cape Town studios we are joined by Gijs Skeppers, CEO of Wise Talk. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you so much for making the time to join us. Frank, let's start off with you laying the landscape out for us. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for ICT development in Africa right now? Okay,
so towards the end of last year we actually commissioned some research across the continent to understand how much investment is actually going into all the pillars of IC and T. And good to see that a lot of countries are actually putting a lot of funds into this, and it's exploding. Nice to see all the internet connectivity that's coming to the continent. Challenge to get that through into the continent, but lots of startups, lots of investment in that area. So yes, it's booming.
Yaron, certainly sounds that the opportunities are there from what Frank has just described for us, but challenges as well, as he makes that statement there. Where do you see the biggest bottlenecks for Africa right now?
Cost of access is still expensive. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to improve. We've got one of the highest costs in the world in terms of bandwidth and data. We also have the ability to improve on our smartphone penetration. We're only at 24%. I think the whole internet connectivity is at 16% around the continent. So it's growing fast and it's exciting and it's a great opportunity, but it's still a relatively small penetration. Yeah,
so we're seeing penetration opportunity. What's stopping us from tapping into it?
I think affordability. As much as there's a need for it, and the internet has changed everything, it has impact on education, on health, on financial services. I think that the affordability of using mobile internet or using internet from a fixed line perspective, which is not really relevant to Africa, is quite expensive.
Gijs, let's bring the conversation to you in Cape Town. We've had the gentleman here laying out the opportunities as well as the broad challenges on the African continent. But let's be solutions orientated. Let's look at those specific markets in Africa where you think this is low-hanging fruits for us to see real ICT revolutions. Where should we be looking?
Well, I think even locally as South Africa, you know, there are tremendous opportunities that present themselves from a startup perspective here. You know, we've got an established economy, but Nigeria, Uganda, there are a number of other countries, including Kenya, that have very high, rates of acceleration in terms of ICT and startup revolution. But I have to agree with Yaron. I think the mere fact that our costs today are so expensive in terms of data transfer on mobile telephony is highly prohibitive. And will slow things down in terms of projections unless these costs come down remarkably, as well as access to the data in terms of fast data over the coming years.
Well, he's spoken about cost and he's put the elephant in the room right in the center of the room, and that is this storm that we're seeing brewing on the South African front in terms of the proposed consolidation in the telco space. What would this mean for ICT development?
Well, in general in a market, if there's consolidation, then obviously it means less competition in the market, and therefore customers potentially have less choice. Across the continent, yes, there probably is going to be some consolidation. Is it needed? Probably, as we increase the scope of the players that are there. And there's a customer benefit in my mind, because by consolidating, you're creating more availability of connectivity and bandwidth, and hopefully costs come down as well. But it's not just about costs, it's about access. And access to that bandwidth is what's key. Otherwise, all these dreams that we have of creating these startups and initiatives, they're not going to work unless you've got that bandwidth running.
I definitely want us to talk about startups, but maybe staying on this issue of cost, Yaron, and in particular the talk of sharing infrastructure and how that is a potential possibility to bring down the cost. Do we have a regulatory environment that allows for those kinds of mergers and acquisition activity to take place?
Most certainly, and I think sharing infrastructure is very positive. We don't need additional footprint if the infrastructure already exists, but there's definitely an opportunity for niche telco players such as MVNOs or the host operator having wholesale agreements with multiple channel partners that will serve niche markets within the market. So
let's take a step back. MVNOs, mobile virgin network operators. I'm quite certain I'm not the only one who doesn't know what that means. Unpack that for us, and in particular, what's the relevance of them entering the market? How does this change the game?
I think it's a very positive step. We've seen a lot of the resellers of mobile getting a margin squeeze, because as the infrastructure costs for new services increase, there's a need for the mobile network operators to reinvest. What MVNOs do is actually use the current infrastructure, so it's a virtual network operator. They don't make use of new infrastructure, and they create unique services that service niche markets. Let's take financial services, for example. A bank might become an MVNO. They already resell airtime at the moment. It makes sense for them to extend their services as a brand extension into the telco space, because it gives them additional customer insight. It lets them get to know their customers better, and they can bundle the financial services with mobile, which is really a huge trend in Africa.
Kees, is that the answer? Do you agree with this perspective being put here in Johannesburg, that MVNOs are potentially game-changing players in the industry?
Yeah, I think absolutely. One other consideration is around where we are with our Wi-Fi infrastructure in South Africa and the rest of Africa. If you're in the United States or you're in Europe, you'll get areas where you've got free Wi-Fi throughout your time in cities, and those are things, whether they're free or not, but are not largely available in many centers of South Africa. So while we've got the mobile telephony side in terms of 3G connectivity, we also have to look at what opportunities can present themselves for Wi-Fi distribution through the major cities and even rural areas of our country in the coming years.
And in the midst of all of that, Frank, we also need to be thinking about a conducive environment for tech startups. Yep. Do we have a culture that sees private equity investors in particular gravitating towards tech startups?
So I think that culture is starting to take shape across the continent. In our research, we saw that there's a number of silicon savannas, as they're called, being formed across the continent. So modeled on the sort of Silicon Valley concept, where you bring sort of academia, you bring technology partners, you bring funding, access to professional services all in one place, and entrepreneurs. And they come through and they say, well, how do I take my idea to the next level? It's early days, but I'm really encouraged to see that there's a number of these across Africa. There's certainly in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Ghana. South Africa has a number of these as well. Do they need to be sort of more regulated? My view is not. I think we should be pushing those even more. And nice to see governments across the continent also putting investment and drive into these areas. So
a number of tech startups in various parts of the continent you're on. Some proposals for some consolidation there to be more attractive to potential investors. Do you think that that's a feasible argument?
Yeah, I think in South Africa, for example, we've got regional initiatives rather than national initiatives. I think the bigger the bulk, the more attractive it is for the entrepreneur. I think it's great to have regional offices, but if all of the different environments like Josie Hub and Innovation Hub in Pretoria had to work closer together, I think it'll be a better service, a better consolidated service to startup entrepreneurs that will serve them better.
Okay, so we're talking about tech startups, but more from the perspective now of how do we improve the attractiveness from an investor point of view. But let's look at the conversation from the other side of the spectrum. How should tech startups be positioning themselves so that they're able to attract that venture capital or those angel investors looking for a small startup that has the potential to be something absolutely phenomenal, to be the next Google?
So I think what's happening, and certainly what we've seen even with our business over the last 24 months, is that the movements, particularly in Stellenbosch, which is now through the University of Stellenbosch, created the Launch Lab, which is really around how people in a startup environment or entrepreneurs with tech ideas can get together in the same place, and they can go and present to angels over, on given days. And that kind of thing is definitely accelerating. We're seeing a lot more of that in Cape Town, particularly over the last 18 to 24 months. But to be absolutely truthful, South Africa as a country has a very poor record of venture capital. If you compare it to the more established markets of the United States and Europe, venture capital, by virtue of its word, in South Africa is virtually non-existent. And unless you have a great network and unless you are have contacts with angels, it's probably very difficult to get something off the ground here with seed capital.
Before we talk...
And from a government perspective...
Yes.
Sorry.
No, do go ahead. From a government perspective, what's the view there, Gijs?
Well, I think, the IDC do have some kind of plans in place where you get kind of tax rebates over periods of times, but you only get tax rebates once your company is profitable, so it doesn't really help you in your startup phase. I think government could certainly do a lot more in terms of providing seed capital or even getting involved in some of these launch labs. As your Honour said, if you look at the innovation hub that is in Gauteng, very successful, and you have access there as a founder member of a startup to access angel capital. But as far as I know, there's no access to government funds from that perspective in terms of seed capital.
Frank, you're nodding. I mean, he did talk about tax incentives. We did hear Pravin Gordhan talking about venture capital tax breaks, but doesn't seem to be enough.
So I agree with Kees that I think it's in the last 12 to 18 months we've seen a change. And even from a government point of view, certainly if we talk from a South Africa perspective, there is more focus on this. So the IDC is putting more funding into this from what I know, and quite happy to engage with startups and look at real seed capital funding. So I think that the willingness is there. Maybe it goes back to culture. I think something that we mentioned earlier. We're just not in that same venture capital mindset that perhaps the US has, but it's changing. That's what
How do we break the culture?
I think it's about celebrating our successes. There's a lot of great South African entrepreneurs that have done really, really well. I think some of them, like Mark Shuttleworth, for example, have reinvested back into the South African entrepreneur environment. I think that we need to educate at universities. We need to maybe create some public-private partnerships, because government might have a willingness but doesn't necessarily have the follow-through. I think also from a foreign direct investment perspective, we need to make South Africa or Africa a far more attractive market for foreign direct investors. What happens with a lot of the mature markets is you'll notice that there's foreign direct investment that is very sustainable, where I think in South Africa it's very volatile, and the fluctuation of our currency has a big impact, and the exit strategy for the investor through an IPO on the JSE or any other African market is quite limited, where an IPO in the US or in the UK market is a lot more attractive.
Of course, that Alibaba IPO is something worth noting. But on that note of exit strategies, we're going to take a short break. But when we return, we're going to be taking a look at how emerging technologies will bridge the technology gap for Africa. See you in 2 minutes. Welcome back. You're still watching Invest Africa. Remember that we do value your suggestions and your feedback. So send us an email, that's investafrica@abn360.com, or interact with us on Twitter. The hashtag is #InvestAfrica, or you can follow us at CNBC Africa, or follow myself at Nozipho. Still with me, my guest, Sirwana Sabi, CEO of Digital Solutions Group, Frank Rizzo, Partner for Information Technology Advisory at KPMG, and Gijs Kappers, CEO of Wise Talk, who joins us from our Cape Town studios. Gijs, let's come to Cape Town first. Just before we went to break, we were talking about the opportunities around exit strategies, and in particular IPOs in the South African financial markets. I mean, if we say that South Africa is far from the developed markets, I mean, what are we saying about Africa, where the exit strategies there must be even slimmer? How then do we continue to attract investors if financial markets are just so poorly developed?
Look, I think from from any tech startup perspective, there has to be some kind of exit strategy in a given time frame, and that time frame can include sales to local South African business, to local African businesses. But if you've got something that really has a potential of global appeal, or you've got something that can perhaps own a segment of the market on a continent, I think there are opportunities, and I think that there are a number of transactions that take place constantly around European conglomerates that are buying South African businesses because they want to own a segment of the African market. And I think that's a real opportunity. I think, you know, the people in Europe and the United States are now starting to realize actually this is a sleeping giant. At the moment, our GDP as a continent is around $2 trillion US. But if you look at every kind of report that comes out, this continent is going to grow rapidly. And in conjunction with the faster bandwidth that's coming down through the east and west coasts of the country through fiber, we're going to see an explosion in ICT. And you know, there's some really, really smart ideas that are being developed by African people, which do have global appeal. But if they don't have global appeal, you know, you look at M-Pesa and you look at a couple of other, you know, a couple of other products that have been launched in the ICT sector in Africa that have been very, very successful and have had buyouts, you know. So it's a question of having a product that has appeal, I guess, you know, and somebody will want to acquire you in time.
Frank, M-Pesa that's been put on the table. We talk about this poster child from Kenya from time to time. Why haven't we been able to replicate the M-Pesa model with as much success in other markets?
Okay, so first I just want to get on what Kees is saying. What I'm very excited about is some African solutions to African problems. And there is a regional view of this, right? So you don't have to necessarily take your stuff and globalize it to be successful. We have some unique challenges on this continent, and there's some really interesting ideas that are starting to form to address those, and M-Pesa is one of them. You know, lack of access to banking and payment systems, and everybody's got a phone. How can we use that phone to facilitate payments and transfers? And that's why that thing has just grown and mushroomed. You ask why it hasn't been successful in other countries. I guess it's a combination of factors. Government intervention, regulatory environments, being able to facilitate that. In a more established financial services market, it becomes more difficult to do that because there's more regulation of necessity because of the bigger volumes. But that could be obstacles and hurdles to jump over. Yeah. So there's that. There's also, if there's an established banking infrastructure already, as there is in South Africa, then it can be seen as another channel. Yeah. What's the differentiator? What's the value add from using that? And I think that's where people have to be quite smart to say, well, yes, I'm trying to solve a problem, but how am I going to make this specific and create value for the user of that particular technology? Two
things that I'm hearing from that particular analysis: changing the face of banking on the continent, but also, Jeroen, this must have implications for remittances, because now M-Pesa is enabling the movement of money across borders. Is this a positive development for that particular space, which traditionally has been dominated by very few players?
Absolutely. I think that the ease of flow of money in Africa is very, very necessary. We need to move cash out of the economy. Cash is quite expensive to manage. It's quite dangerous. We've got very high crime statistics across the continent because it's primarily a cash-driven economy. And I believe that with the evolution of where mobile money transfer across borders makes it a lot easy for migrant workers. In South Africa especially, we have a lot of people that have families still in Zimbabwe or Malawi, and they need to transfer money back to them. It makes it so much easier for them to work in this country but then transfer the money across. Certain countries in Africa have got such a low GDP or such a constraint and reliance on export to be able to make their currency valuable that I think the evolution of African trade would be very, very positive for the economy in Africa. And if we could get an afro like the euro, or get some kind of a currency that's common and makes it easy. So for example, in Malawi, you have to wait for the tobacco auction before you can actually get foreign money outside of the country, because there isn't foreign currency until the tobacco auction, which happens once a year around August or September. So it makes it quite difficult unless we simplify it. And as Frank said, and Kees, African solutions for African problems.
Kees, let's go back and let's hop on this new theme that's taken over the show, African solutions for African problems. And in particular, let's talk about whether ICT has stepped up to the game in terms of meeting some of the development challenges that we have on the continent.
Look, I think, I can only speak on behalf of what our business has done. I mean, we're providing a specific solution for African problems. And I think that one thing which I have to say is that, our business, and as Jeroen's business, develops world-class products, and we as South Africans, as was said earlier, need to celebrate the successes of what we're actually able to achieve, because as South Africans with South African coders, we are building world-class technology, and we should be celebrating that more. It should be in the press more. It should be, it should be shouted from the rooftops, actually. And the more that happens, and the more exposure South African startups get in terms of, the risk that the guys are undertaking, but also the sheer skills base that we have as a nation, needs to be celebrated. We are highly entrepreneurial as a culture, but we have some really gifted people, some really skilled coders, and these are things we should actually celebrate much more frequently than what happens currently.
Take that to the sort of African level, and the same applies, if not more. I mean, there's such talent and skill in a number of the African countries that are just looking for an outlet, and technology enables that. But you need to have the connectivity, the speeds need to be there. So certainly my colleagues in Nigeria and in Kenya, so the different coasts, the ideas and the initiatives that are coming up there are incredible. But they just need to be nurtured, have an environment where those things can flourish.
But how do we replicate then? I mean, we spoke about Silicon Savannah earlier on, and again, we have a pocket of excellence on the continent, but we've got such a huge, massive continent. Why can't we bring these to scale and replicate?
But you've got to start somewhere, I guess, but it's a combination of all the factors we've spoken about. So funding that needs to just ramp up across the continent. Infrastructure, yes, while it's there and the basic form is there, the speed needs to increase, and cost.
Yaron, interesting stat that I picked up, that more Africans have access to mobile phones than have access to clean drinking water.
Wow.
Now, for me, that's two opposite ends of the spectrum, which is very, very problematic. And I want to bring back the conversation to leveraging off ICT for developmental goals. Are we doing enough? Is the government doing enough? And is business doing enough to actually try and bridge these gaps?
I think there's a huge opportunity there for M-government, for M-health, for mobile learning and education, and the mobile phone has certainly got the potential to reach it. I don't believe we're maximizing the potential. There's some great solutions that are available to monitor water, to enhance electricity, and the whole trend globally of going towards a smarter home. Unfortunately, we have a much more basic need in Africa, often to the bulk of the population, is to provide basic services, as you mentioned, clean water and electricity. If we could just get electricity to the bulk of the continent. I think it's improving and it's positive, but I think a lot more can be done.
We talk a lot about M-health in particular, and these paperless hospitals. Do we have an example where we see this? Is there a country that's leading and that we can say, in this particular country, they've certainly got the model right? Let's talk about how we replicate that model now.
Yeah, so going with the theme of African problems, African solutions, malaria seems to be a problem on the continent, and I've been involved with the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Oh, that's a good one, the Belinda Gates.
The Belinda Gates. I just combined the two, absolutely. So I've been working with them and Nando's and Standard Bank, and a lot of big corporates in South Africa got behind MTN around dealing with malaria as an issue on the continent. And part of the problem was distributing nets, because that's just an easy solution to be able to prevent malaria. But another big issue was education and mobile learning. And we created a mobile learning program across the continent that people could become more aware of malaria. And I think that this talks to one area of M-health. I heard last night from a colleague of mine who works for Samsung that there's kind of like injecting tools that allow you to inject once only, because there's such desperation for equipment and needles that the needles are used over and over again, and therefore get contaminated and disease actually spreads. So, we have unique issues in Africa that we need to deal with. I think technology is certainly there, and we can learn a lot from what's happening globally, but we've got to act local and understand the local dilemmas.
Okay, so we've just heard Yaron punting all of his clients that he works with, all of these companies, but let's look at the government side of this. What is it that we need to unlock ICT so that it can it can serve development targets more? Is it a question of policy? Is it a question of a slice of the national budget? Is it a question of regulation? What does government need to do to make this work?
So I think, there have been a couple of hot points which have been raised over the course of this interview, but I think primarily, there's a will from government. Whether it gets to execute it all the time is a question, but it has a massive task on its hands. It has a housing issue to deal with, electricity, water, but also amongst all, and health, but amongst all of that is education. Now if we had to allow or create Wi-Fi networks throughout our country where schools, even in rural areas, could connect to the internet, and there are instances where Wikipedia will allow and MTN, I think, are doing a deal now that you'll get free downloads onto Wikipedia through an MTN network. You look at the Chromebooks that Google are building, which are, you know, sub $100, $120 notebooks. If those get distributed and guys have access to internet, and you wrap that with education, you know, that's where you're going to see some real change happening, and very quickly, in my opinion.
Some final comments from you, Frank. I mean, we've heard some of the examples of mHealth and e-education in particular, but where do you see the continent going in terms of the opportunities that lie there for ICT? And this is where we started the show. Maybe let's close it on that note.
Okay, so to me, it creates the opportunity to leapfrog certain technologies. And I think M-Pesa is a great example of that, where you don't have to wait for a formal banking system to be fully in place and mobile channels, etc. Suddenly, with the advent of the phone, you are able to do what people in developed economies have been doing for years, but just on a different platform. So I think across Africa, we have an opportunity to leapfrog things that we don't have to now do and dig things into the ground, because we've got different technology. And that investment could be channeled in different ways. So it creates a massive opportunity for us.
African technology solutions to African problems. That's the theme that dominated the show today. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Thank you to all our guests once again. And Bruce Whitfield is up next as he unpacks the latest news from South Africa's economy on Tonight with Bruce. Until next time, it's goodbye, and thank you for joining us.